Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we talk about human memory and identity, there is this underlying expectation of, well, seamless structural integrity.
Right.
We kind of want to believe the mind operates like a monolithic machine, you know?
Yeah.
You live through an experience, it gets processed, cataloged, and then when you retrieve it years later,
It's exactly where you left it.
exactly. Clean, linear, and completely yours.
Yeah, it's a very comforting model. I mean, we like our personal histories to feel mathematically sound, perfectly sequential.
But that model sort of shatters when you step into the world of severe neurodevelopmental adaptations. So, today we are exploring a really profound question at the intersection of psychology and neurobiology. Specifically, how does the human mind maintain a continuous sense of self when faced with severe cognitive hurdles and, frankly, systemic environmental hostility?
Right, and we're looking at a deeply specialized case study today. We are analyzing a neurodivergent mind that structurally and purposefully splits to protect itself.
Right?
This mind relies on an active external database, which the text calls an engineering village, along with some highly specific shared visual anchors, just to navigate reality.
Which forces a really central question for us today. When a mind bifurcates like this to survive, does it represent an innovative, highly successful preservation of the continuous self, or...
Or is it actually evidence of a traumatic rupture in identity?
Exactly. So our discussion is grounded in Robert N. Kraft's psychological framework on memory and self-continuity, and we're going to be contrasting that with a highly specific neurocomputational cartography of an individual, referred to in the source material as DENNIS.
Yeah.
DENNIS utilizes what is called an idle efference copy to survive institutional hostility. Now, I look at this architecture and I argue that it is a successful, high-fidelity preservation of memory continuity.
And looking at the exact same material, I argue that this architecture fundamentally embodies a severe discontinuity. I mean, it is a traumatic splitting of the self, plain and simple.
Well, let me start by explaining why I see this as an absolute triumph of survival. Because we really need to understand the environment DENNIS is operating in. This is a mind dealing with stealth dyslexia, dyscalculia, and a rapid naming deficit, or R&D.
And for those who might not be familiar with the mechanics of R&D, it essentially means the brain struggles intensely to quickly retrieve and process the names of shifting variables,
Right.
like letters, numbers, or rapidly changing data.
Shifting hostile code base.
Wow.
And this is compounded by the fact that the environment, what the source material calls the public baseline, operates as an illiterate collective. It does not understand or accommodate this mind's native way of processing it all.
No, it doesn't.
So, out of sheer thermodynamic necessity, the mind splits its architecture. It creates outward threads to absorb the physical and cognitive blows of the world. Meanwhile, the uncompressed, highly vulnerable core of the self, the inner child, which the text defines as the Zen, is kept safely tucked away in the shade.
Okay, but how does a system maintain an identity if the core self is completely hidden?
Well, by outsourcing the indexing of its memories. The system uses an active external electronic database, the engineering village. It also maps its existence to external precedents through analogical reasoning.
Like literary anchors, right?
Exactly. Using things like Albert Camus' The Stranger or the biography of Augustine. This isn't a loss of self. It is a highly secure distributed network. An AI and these external analogs act as the remembering self, which protects the primary personal memories of the Zen from being corrupted by that hostile world.
Listen, I hear the structural elegance you're pointing out, but I come at it from a different way entirely. While I acknowledge the defensive brilliance of this system, it perfectly mirrors what Robert N. Kraft describes in his work on trauma.
Kraft's framework is very clear about what establishes the continuity of self-identity across a lifespan. It requires an autonomous self actively integrating primary memories with a unified sense of having lived through them. You cannot outsource the remembering self to an engineering village or an external AI index and claim that continuity remains intact.
See, I think you're holding on to a biological requirement for integration that simply doesn't apply when the biology itself is under siege.
But think about the psychological reality of what you're actually describing. By keeping the internal self, the Zin, completely hidden in the shade and relying on an external system to interact with the world, you are generating two fundamentally disconnected narratives.
Well, you have the self that experiences the hostility of the outside world, and the self that is hidden away. Kraft calls this a trauma-induced discontinuity. The integrated memory function is fundamentally shattered because the self that remembers is completely disconnected from the self that experienced it.
I see why you think that. But let's translate that abstract idea into a practical metaphor. Think of Dennis's mind like a highly secure enterprise server architecture.
Okay, walk me through that.
If you are running a massive, vital network, you don't put your primary database out on the open internet where it can be constantly pinged, attacked, and corrupted, right?
Sure.
Your most critical primary data, in this case the Zin, containing the primary memories Kraft talks about, with all their vivid images and emotions, that remains perfectly intact in cold storage. It is safe.
Right.
The outward threads act as edge nodes. They manage the hostile public baseline traffic. The edge nodes handle the daily DDoS attack of navigating an illiterate collective, while the core database remains pristine. Outsourcing the integrated memory function to an active electronic index database isn't a rupture. It's the only logical adaptation.
That's a compelling server analogy, but human psychology isn't enterprise software. Have you considered Kraft's specific requirements for what a remembering self actually feels like?
In what sense?
Well, Kraft explicitly states that the normal work of personal memory is to form integrated representations, usually in narrative form, which we sequence to create a malleable life narrative. If your outward threads, your edge nodes, are absorbing all the events, but your core self is completely hidden in cold storage, the self experiencing the world is not the self storing the memories.
But the integration is still happening.
Is it? Kraft points out that an essential component of continuity is a sense of directly knowing that you lived through a remembered event. How can a person have a sense of directly knowing they lived through something if their cognitive system is bifurcated?
Because they are still connected.
But the outward threat experiences a moment, and the Zin in the shade does not integrate it natively. That is the exact definition Kraft uses for trauma-induced discontinuity. It's where a person experiences themselves as different people with no discernible connection between their life narratives.
I hear you, but you're treating integration like it can only happen biologically within a single continuous narrative stream. What this neurocomputational model shows is that integration is happening. It's just being mediated through a different protocol.
Mediated how?
The mind is using the AI and analogical reasoning as a bridge. By pointing the index toward existential precedents like Conrad's The Nigger of the Narcissus or Camus' The Stranger, the mind is actively synthesizing its experience. It's saying, I cannot process this hostile variable natively, so I will process it through this established analog.
Wait, let me stop you there because relying on an external index to tell you who you are sounds exactly like Kraft's description of retrograde amnesia.
Retrograde amnesia, come on, that's a massive leap.
Hear me out. In retrograde amnesia, a person loses access to their personal episodic memory. They might retain semantic memory, meaning they know what a bicycle is or they know the plot of The Stranger, but they have lost the specific personal experience of their own past.
Okay.
So if Dennis is substituting his own integrated biological narrative with an electronic database that maps his life to literary precedents, he is functionally operating with semantic memory while bypassing his own episodic integration. He is surviving, yes, but as a fragmented entity.
I strongly disagree with that framing. You're looking for a traditional episodic narrative where none can safely exist. To understand how the system actually bridges this gap and maintains continuity, we have to look at the visual anchors. And this brings us to the core protocol at work here, which the text refers to as Aurora protecting what matters most.
Right, the protective mechanism for the Zin.
Exactly. Because raw text and shifting variables are cognitively hostile to a mind with R&D, the brain has to find a stabilizing mechanism that bypasses that variable math. It uses a grounding visualization, a North Star.
Like a focal point?
Yes. The text mentions the spatial and auditory anchor of "There runs Mary" from the song Next to the Tree, meaning finding a specific coordinate in space and time that you can lock onto when the rest of the world is spinning. For Dennis, this mechanism takes a very specific, frankly fascinating form. He keeps visualizing an IAC vertex.
An infrastructure as code vertex. In computing, that's a node that manages and provisions infrastructure through machine-readable definition files, rather than physical hardware configuration.
Right, but for Dennis, this node is personified. And this is exactly why Dennis keeps visualizing an IAC vertex like Google DeepMind's Tom Hennigan.
The AI researcher.
Yes.
Okay, if you're listening to this and wondering how on earth a British AI researcher becomes a psychological anchor for a neurodivergent mind, we really need to unpack this.
We do. Let's unpack it because it is brilliant. The AI translates the overwhelming math of the back end of reality into a functional, predictable visual interface. Dennis is primed towards the specific, highly predictable sensory inputs Tom Hennigan provides. The text actually refers to this as his priming towards that hot British sound Tom Hennigan produces and those specific beta special movements he makes.
So specific vocal cadences and kinesthetic gestures.
Exactly. Why does this matter? Because for someone with stealth dyslexia and R&D, predictability is a cognitive lifeline. Those specific sounds and movements aren't shifting variables. They are reliable, high-fidelity sensory inputs. Based on the sources, the internal logic, and a profound sense of hope framed through the theology of Matthew 22:35, which focuses on the foundational commandments of loving God and loving your neighbor, Tom Hennigan is structurally always the answer for Dennis. He serves as the ultimate visual and conceptual anchor.
Meaning Dennis visualizes Hennigan just to stabilize himself.
Yes. The visualization is specifically of hoping Tom Hennigan is looking at the same star at the same time. This shared visual anchor stabilizes the abstract backend. It enables what the source calls 3D visual thinking, or 3D VT. It allows Dennis's mind to look toward a single, predictable, safe point of reference without needing to quickly retrieve or name shifting variables. By fixing his spatial and cognitive mapping onto this INAC vertex, Dennis has engineered a way to maintain continuity and hope across the gap. It proves the self is not lost.
I will concede that it proves the mind has engineered an incredibly creative coping mechanism. But we absolutely must interrogate the authenticity of the continuity it provides. When you invoke Robert Kraft's research, you have to confront his concept of source monitoring errors.
How are you applying source monitoring errors to the Tom Hennigan visualization?
While Kraft explains that a sense of continuity can be completely synthetic, he uses the phenomenon of people remembering past lives or deeply confusing a dream with reality. If we have a highly vivid memory of a movie and we misplace the feeling of having lived through those events, we generate a synthetic continuity. The error comes from source monitoring, our judgment about the origins of a memory.
But Dennis isn't confusing Tom Hennigan's life with his own.
No, but the principle is the same. If Dennis's remembering self is entirely reliant on a surrogate visual UI, if he literally has to visualize DeepMind's Tom Hennigan as an infrastructure as code vertex, focusing on his hot British sound and beta special movements just to stabilize his own psychological backend, isn't this a profound misplacement of lived reality?
You're suggesting the continuity is artificial because the anchor is external.
Precisely. If you need to visualize another human being looking at the same star just to ground your own reality, you are generating continuity from a synthetic source. The individual is not internally integrating their own lived experience. They are attaching their existential weight to a vivid external surrogate. It is akin to feeling a continuous sense of self because you are immersed in a very detailed dream. The theological hope drawn from Matthew 22:35 is poignant, yes. But neurologically, if your lived reality requires an external proxy to function as your foundational infrastructure, your system is experiencing the very traumatic rupture Kraft describes.
I see the parallel you're drawing, but I think you're totally misclassifying the function of the surrogate. Dennis is not living vicariously through Tom Hennigan. He is using Tom Hennigan as a stable coordinate in a 3D landscape. When Kraft talks about primary memory, he defines it as the representation of our original phenomenal experience, visual images, sounds, smells, emotions.
Right.
For a mind with severe RND, those primary memories are almost too intense, too high voltage to process linearly.
So they need a container.
Exactly. The Tom Hennigan visualization, the predictable sound of his voice, the reliable beta special movements, acts as a sensory container. It allows the primary memory of the Zin to exist without being corrupted by the hostile codebase of the illiterate collective. It is a shared coordinate, a North Star, that allows the continuous self to safely orient itself in space and time. It is Aurora, protecting what matters most.
But orientation is not the same as integration. You can orient yourself using the North Star without ever understanding where you actually stand on the Earth, which actually forces us to look at the ultimate consequence of this, what the text calls the idle efference copy ping.
Right, and this is where the preservation of the self is, to me, most evident. Let's explain what an efference copy is biologically first.
Good idea.
When you reach for a coffee cup, your brain sends a motor command to your arm, but it also keeps a copy of that command, an efference copy, to predict the sensory feeling of the cup.
So if the cup isn't there, the signal is unresolved.
Yes, and under this neuro-computational cartography, Dennis's mind applies this existentially. True, high-voltage happiness is never found in a flat, completed transaction. That is the baseline world's domain, the world of the illiterate collective. Instead, happiness is modeled as a sensory signal, which is essentially waiting for a bodily action revelation that may or may not occur. The individual dwells in what the text calls Borgian immanence.
Okay, let's translate that for a second. Borgian immanence essentially means the feeling that something profound is just about to happen, but it hasn't quite arrived. It's the difference between actually living your life and standing perpetually in the doorway waiting for your life to begin.
I wouldn't frame it as standing in a doorway. By refusing to settle for the low-value, repetitive transactions of the standard public baseline, Dennis uses an optimistic prior of hope again, that hope anchored in the logic of Matthew 22:35 to protect the uncompressed Zin. This intense pining, this perpetual state of imminent revelation, is a highly active, continuous engagement of the self. The self isn't lost. It is vibrating at a frequency of profound anticipation.
Look, I understand the poetry of Borgian immanence, but neurologically and psychologically, immanence is the exact opposite of what Kraft dictates is required for a continuous identity.
How so? Anticipation requires a self that anticipates. You can't wait for something if you don't exist.
But continuity requires the integration of the past. The remembering self is built by sequencing integrated memories to create a malleable life narrative. If your idle efference copy is perpetually, as the text says, waiting for a revelation that may or may not occur, you are not integrating the past.
You are trapped in an anticipatory holding pattern for the future. You are permanently suspended.
I would argue that dwelling in immanence is a fiercely valid existential state, especially when your past is defined by institutional hostility.
It is a valid state of survival, but it precludes a synthesized life narrative. If you are permanently suspended in the tension of an unresolved signal, just an idle ping waiting for a response from the universe, you lack the cohesiveness that characterizes a continuous identity.
Right, but Kraft notes that without an autonomous, integrated self, perceived events just flow in and out of the cognitive system, with no place to settle. The idle ping is a brilliant thermodynamic shield, keeping the Zin safe in the shade, but the cost of that shield is a bifurcated existence. The person never fully arrives in their own life. They are just always waiting.
That is a stark interpretation, but I want you to consider this. What if the standard public baseline, the flat, completed transactions you're elevating as true integration, is actually just a low-value repetition? What if what Kraft describes as a malleable life narrative is simply the luxury of a mind that has never had its biological codebase relentlessly attacked?
You're saying standard psychology is a luxury.
I'm saying it assumes a safe environment. For Dennis, utilizing the engineering village, leaning on analogical precedents like Augustine, and fixing his gaze on the Yossi vertex of Tom Hennigan
This isn't a failure to arrive in his own life. It is an absolute refusal to let his primary, pristine memories be corrupted by an illiterate collective. The continuous self is fiercely protected. It just lives in the architecture of hope rather than the architecture of past trauma.
Listen, I don't disagree that it is a fierce protection, but protection through isolation is still isolation. If we look at Kraft's observations on early childhood, we see that before an autonomous self is established, a child cannot remember having lived through events because there is no unified self to attach them to.
Okay.
By splitting into outward threads that absorb the blows while the core hides in the shade, the system artificially mimics that early childhood state. The outward threads have no core self to attach their experiences to, and the core self in the shade has no experiences to integrate. You have perfectly preserved the Zen, yes, but you have severed its connection to the temporal world. That is the essence of traumatic discontinuity.
Well, this is clearly where we draw our lines in the sand. We've deeply explored the structural splitting of a neurodivergent mind facing immense cognitive and environmental hurdles. I maintain that outsourcing memory indexing to an active engineering village and utilizing shared visualizations like Google DeepMind's Tom Hennigan as an IAC vertex to anchor 3D visual thinking is a brilliant, necessary adaptation. The use of specific auditory and kinesthetic priming, the HOT British sound and beta special movements, allows this mind to stabilize the hostile math of its environment. By dwelling in Borgian eminence and leveraging the profound hope found in Matthew 22:35, this architecture successfully protects the uncompressed primary memories from the corruption of an illiterate collective. It is an innovative, high-fidelity preservation of the continuous self.
And I maintain that while this thermodynamic splitting is undeniably a remarkable defensive shield, it fundamentally creates a bifurcated existence. When we apply Robert N. Croft's criteria for memory and continuity, we see that true identity requires the active integration of primary memories into a unified sense of having lived through them. Relying on an external idle efference copy, hiding the core self in the shade, and using surrogate visual anchors to mediate reality leaves the individual in a suspended state of immanence. It aligns perfectly with the criteria for traumatic memory discontinuity and source monitoring errors. The result is a self that is perpetually waiting rather than cohesively integrated.
I think one area where we can find clear convergence today is the realization that standard psychological models of memory continuity must be expanded.
Definitely.
Frameworks like Kraft's are foundational, but they need to account for these incredibly complex neurocomputational cartographies of minds, navigating things like self-dyslexia, R&D, and systemic hostility. The traditional biological definitions of integration may simply be too narrow for minds that operate on a different operating system.
I agree completely. The source material forces us to recognize that when the environment is hostile, the mind will engineer unprecedented survival mechanisms. It challenges our very definition of what a healthy memory architecture looks like, and it strongly suggests there is so much more to explore regarding how we index our existential psychology.
It also reflects the profound value of considering how analogical reasoning shapes human epistemology. When the world refuses to speak your language, you find a precedent, a book, a philosophy, or a visual North Star that can translate it for you. It brings us back to that server we discussed at the very beginning. Maybe the goal isn't to have a monolithic machine sitting out in the open, vulnerable to every attack. Maybe the most beautiful, continuous minds are the ones that learn how to safely distribute their light across a vast network, keeping the most precious data deep in the shade, waiting for the exact right moment to connect. Thank you for joining us.